Real stories. Extreme survival. No fiction. Welcome to Stories by Candlelight.
The fog didn't just hide the horizon. It hid the monster growing under my skin. We were 5 miles away from the crash site, but it felt like 5,000. My right hand, the one that touched the frozen woman, wasn't mine anymore. It was heavy, like a piece of dead wood, and the skin was the color of a rainy Mumbai sky, dull, stony, and lifeless. "Sam, you're walking funny," Kabir croaked from the sled. I didn't answer. How could I? I couldn't tell him that every time my heart beat, I felt a cold, oily liquid pumping through my veins instead of blood. I couldn't tell him that the black veins on my arm were twitching, like worms trying to find a way out. "Eat a biscuit, Sam. You need the energy," Kabir insisted, reaching for the small bag. "No," I barked. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was deep, rattling, like stones grinding together. "Keep the biscuits, Kabir. I'm not hungry anymore." That was the biggest lie of my life. I was starving, but not for biscuits. I was looking at the back of Kabir's neck, the way the pulse throbbed there, warm and rhythmic. My mouth watered, but the saliva felt thick and cold. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, trying to remind myself that I was human. I was Sam. I was a survivor from the streets, not a parasite of the ice. But the Arctic is a patient hunter. It doesn't break your body first. It breaks your mind. The silence began to scream again. Not the wind, but the voices of the standing forest. They weren't behind us anymore. They were ahead. The weather station appeared like a ghost through the haze. A tall, rusted iron tower with a small concrete cabin at its base. It looked abandoned, half buried in a drift of snow that looked like a frozen wave. "We're here, Kabir. Look." I tried to cheer him up, but my jaw felt stiff, my muscles refusing to cooperate. I dragged the sled to the heavy steel door of the cabin. I didn't use the handle. I just leaned my gray shoulder against it, and with a strength that felt borrowed from a nightmare, the hinges snapped like toothpicks. We tumbled inside. It was dark. It smelled of old grease and dry rot, but it was out of the wind. "Matches." "Sam, find matches," Kabir pleaded. I fumbled in the dark. My gray hand touched a metal table, and wherever my fingers landed, they left a thin frost. I found a Flera handheld signal torch. I struck it. The room flooded with a harsh, flickering orange light. And that's when we saw it. The station wasn't empty. In the corner, sitting in a chair, was a man. He was wearing a headset, his hands still resting on a radio set that had been dead for decades. He wasn't a skeleton. He was preserved, his skin perfectly intact, his eyes open and staring at the wall. "Another one," Kabir whispered, his voice shaking. "Sam, why are they all like this? Why don't they rot?" I walked closer to the radio operator. I saw a logbook on the desk. The last entry was dated December 1974. It said, "The hunger isn't coming from the stomach. It's coming from the air. Miller touched the ice today. He says he can hear the white. We are locking the door, but the white is already inside us. Asterisk." I looked at my gray hand. The black veins were now reaching my elbow. "Sam, what does it say?" Kabir asked, trying to sit up. I closed the book. "It says we're safe, Kabir. It says help is coming." Another lie. Suddenly, the radio, the ancient, rusted. Unpowered radio emitted a burst of static. Asterisk crackle, she, Sam. Asterisk. Kabir screamed. I backed away, my heart, or whatever was left of it, freezing in my chest. Asterisk, Sam. Give him to the ice. Asterisk, the radio whispered. It wasn't a broadcast. It was the room. The walls were talking. Sam, look at your arm. Kabir yelled, pointing a trembling finger. Under the orange glow of the flare, the black veins weren't just moving, they were breaking the surface of my skin. Small, needle-like black shards were sprouting from my pores. I felt a surge of cold fire. My vision turned white. Get away from me, Kabir! I roared, falling to my knees. Run! Get out of here! I can't walk, Sam. You know I can't walk. I looked at him. In my white blind eyes, Kabir didn't look like my friend anymore. He looked like a glowing heat source. A battery. Food. The gray hand reached out, moving on its own, its fingers lengthening, the nails turning into jagged black talons. Asterisk, scratch. 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 Asterisk. Something was at the door. Not the wind. The things from the standing forest had followed my gray trail. They were crowded outside the cabin, their frozen faces pressed against the small reinforced glass window. They're here for me, I whispered, the grays spreading to my neck, making my voice sound like a blizzard. Or they're here for what I'm about to do to you. The flare sputtered and died. The room went pitch black. All that could be heard was Kabir's terrified breathing and the sound of something heavy and stone-like crawling across the floor toward him. The episode ends with Sam's voice whispering in the dark. Kabir, don't move. I can smell your warmth. To be continued in episode 4, The White Heart. The darkness in the cabin wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, and smelled like ancient ice and rotten copper. I could hear Kabir's heart not like a normal person hears sound, but like a drumbeat vibrating through the floorboards. To my new, gray ears, that heartbeat sounded like a dinner bell. Sam, please. Say something. You're scaring me. Kabir's voice was a thin thread in the dark. I was crouched in the corner, my body contorted in ways that should have snapped my spine. But I didn't feel pain. I felt power. The black shards sticking out of my arm were cold, but they felt like armor. I'm still here, Kabir, I said. But it wasn't my voice. It sounded like two sheets of rusted metal sliding against each other. But Sam is getting smaller. The white is taking up all the space. I could see him now, even without light. He was glowing with a soft orange warmth. His blood, moving through his veins, looked like molten gold. My stomach didn't just growl. It roared. The radio. Sam. The radio said to give me to the ice. What did it mean? Kabir was sobbing now, dragging his useless legs toward the door. I moved. I didn't walk. I glided across the floor like a shadow. I pinned his hand to the floor with my gray stone-like palm. The moment I touched his warm skin, a jolt of electricity ran through me. It felt better than any drug, any food, any heat I had ever known. It means, I whispered, leaning my cold face next to his ear, that the Arctic doesn't want you dead. It wants you to become part of the machine. And I'm the one who has to plug you in. Suddenly, the cabin door began to groan. The steel was bending inward. Those things the standing dead weren't just scratching anymore. They were pushing. Hundreds of them, driven by the same hive mind that was currently rewriting my DNA. Asterisk crack. Asterisk. The reinforced glass window shattered. A hand reached in. It was white, hairless, and had fingers like icicles. Then another, and another. "They're coming for us!" Kabir screamed. The fear in his voice did something to me. For a split second, the Tapori, Sam the boy from the Mumbai streets who never left a brother behind, flashed back to life. "No," I growled, standing up and facing the door. "They're coming for asterisk, you asterisk. But you're asterisk, my asterisk brother. And nobody touches my family. Not even the devil himself." I turned toward the broken window. I didn't use a weapon. I used my arm, the gray, shard-covered limb. I swung it like a mace. When it hit the reaching hands, there was a sound of glass shattering. The frozen limbs of the monsters broke into 1,000 pieces. "Is that all you've got?" I yelled at the fog. "I've survived the Mumbai police, the local gangs, and the hunger of the slums. You think a little frostbite is going to take me?" But the more I fought, the more the gray spread. It was halfway up my face now. My right eye was gone, replaced by a solid orb of pale blue ice. I was saving Kabir's life, but I was losing my soul to do it. The radio operator, the frozen man in the chair, suddenly stood up. He hadn't moved in 50 years, but now his joints were popping like gunshots. "The heart," the operator croaked, his voice coming from his stomach. "To stop the change, you must find the white heart under the station. In the deep." "What heart? What are you talking about?" I grabbed the operator, but his body was as cold as a glacier. "The core of the storm," he whispered, his eyes finally clouding over as he collapsed into a pile of ice dust. "Destroy it, or become it." I looked at Kabir. He was pale, shivering, and looking at me with a mix of terror and pity. "Sam, look at the floor," Kabir pointed. Where I was standing, the ice was melting into a perfect circle. A hatch. An iron grate leading down into the permafrost. A ladder descended into a blue, glowing abyss. "I have to go down there, Kabir," I said, my voice barely human now. "If I don't, I'm going to eat you. And I don't want to do that. Stay here. Use the radio operator's coat. If I don't come back in an hour, use that last flare on yourself. Don't let them take you alive." I didn't wait for his answer. I jumped into the hole. The air down there wasn't just cold. It was ancient. The walls weren't made of rock or soil. They were made of frozen bodies, thousands of them, stacked like cordwood, all pulsing with a faint, rhythmic blue light. Asterisk. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Asterisk. The Arctic had a heart, and I was standing right in front of it. It was a giant crystalline organ, suspended in the center of the cavern, beating with a frozen energy that was calling my name. "Welcome home, Sam," the heart whispered directly into my brain. The episode ends with Sam reaching out his gray hand toward the glowing heart, while above him, the sound of the cabin door finally giving way echoes down the shaft. To be continued in Episode 5, The Frozen Bargain. The air in the cavern wasn't air anymore. It was something thick, ancient, and alive. Every time the white heart pulsed, the walls made of frozen bodies hummed in a low, terrifying vibration. I stood before it, my gray hand glowing with the same sickly blue light. "Sam, they're inside. Sam, help me." Kabir's scream echoed down the shaft from the cabin above. The standing dead had broken through. I could hear the sound of metal tearing and Kabir's desperate attempts to keep them back. My instinct was to climb back up, to fight like the street dog I was, but my feet were stuck. Not by ice, but by the heart's command. "Sam, stay," the heart whispered, not in words, but in a feeling that flooded my mind. Images flashed before my eyes, not of the Arctic, but of Mumbai. I saw myself back at the Naka, healthy, with a pocket full of cash and a plate of hot food. I saw a life where I was settled. No more running, no more hunger, no more cold. "I can give you everything," the voice inside the blue light promised. The power to never feel pain. The power to rule the ice. Just let him go. Give the boy to the forest, and you shall be the king of the white. I looked at my gray arm. The black shards were now pulsing in time with the heart. I wasn't Sam the survivor anymore. I was becoming a god of the graveyard. It would be so easy to say yes, to stop fighting, to let the cold take the struggle away. A loud crash came from above, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. They had him. The frozen things were pulling Kabir toward the open hatch. "You want a bargain?" I roared at the heart. My voice was no longer human. It was the sound of a glacier cracking open. "You want to give me a life of luxury? You think a tepori from the Chawls can be bought with a few dreams?" I reached into my pocket, my fingers stiff and stone-like, found the last thing I had, brought from the plane, the half bottle of kerosene. It was almost frozen, but not quite. "I don't want your kingdom," I screamed. "I don't want to be settled in a grave." I smashed the bottle against the side of the glowing crystal heart. The liquid splashed across its pulsing surface. The heart let out a shriek, a high-pitched frequency that made my ears bleed. The blue light flickered, turning a violent, angry purple. The walls of bodies started to move. The thousands of frozen corpses in the cavern walls began to reach for me, their fingers clawing out of the ice like white worms. "You are nothing." The heart boomed, its voice vibrating through my teeth. "I'm Sam," I yelled, pulling out the flare gun I had tucked into my belt. "And in my world, we don't settle for deals with monsters." I didn't aim for the heart. I aimed for the kerosene-soaked floor at its base. Asterisk boom. Asterisk. The flare ignited the fuel. In an environment that had been frozen for millennia, the sudden heat was like a nuclear explosion. The cavern erupted in orange fire. The heart screamed again, but this time it was a sound of agony. The blue light began to crack. Spiders of white fire ran across the crystal surface. Upstairs, the effect was instant. I heard the standing dead screeching as they lost their connection to the hive mind. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were just piles of old, dry ice falling apart. But the fire was consuming the oxygen, and the cavern was starting to collapse. Huge chunks of ice and frozen limbs were falling from the ceiling. I looked at my hand. The gray was receding. As the heart weakened, the curse was breaking. My skin was turning red and raw, the pain returning with a vengeance. It hurt like hell, and it was the most beautiful feeling in the world. "I'm coming for you, Kabir," I yelled, grabbing the rusted ladder. I climbed like a madman, the fire licking at my boots. As I reached the top and hauled myself back into the cabin, I saw Kabir. He was lying near the hatch, surrounded by the shattered remains of the monsters. He was unconscious, but his chest was still moving. I grabbed him, threw him over my shoulder, and looked at the weather station door. The fog outside was clearing. For the first time, the wind didn't sound like a hunter. It just sounded like wind. but as we stepped out into the snow, I felt a sharp, cold sting in the back of my neck. I reached back and pulled out a tiny black shard that hadn't melted. I looked back at the burning station. The heart was destroyed, but the shard in my hand was still pulsing. A small, faint blue light. "It's not over," I whispered to the unconscious Kabir. It just changed its shape. The episode ends with Sam walking into the dawn. His eyes normal, but his shadow on the snow, it's still tall, thin, and has claws. To be continued in episode 6, The Long Walk.